Let me introduce the speakers now. Anna Pekova is the Deputy Director at Prospera, the International Network of Women's Funds. Prospera is a network of 44 autonomous and independent women's funds that collectively provide grants in over 178 countries. Established in the early 2000s, the Prospera network has grown from an affinity group of women's funds into a membership-driven and led feminist funding network that furthers women's, girls, and trans people's human rights. Natalia Tariq is the Resource and Mobilization Coordinator at the Association for Progressive Communications. APC is an international network of 62 organizations and 29 individuals who collectively work across 74 countries. Established in 1990, APC is both an organization and membership-based network of organizations and activists committed to empowering people to use the internet to contribute to equitable human development, social justice, participatory political processes, and environmental sustainability. Sarah Miller is the newly appointed Chief Executive at Principia Advisory. Prior to her current role as CEO, she spent 9 years at CARE International as their Global Director of Organizational Development and head of their 2020 Transformational Change. CARE is a global confederation of 21 independent organizations who work in 104 countries to defeat poverty. Established in the 1940s, CARE has grown from a cooperative group of American charities providing emergency relief packages into a confederated network of national organizations that fight to address the root causes of poverty with a focus on gender inequality. And finally, Sati Houston, the designer and facilitator of today's discussion, is a strategist with a decade of experience within for-profit and non-profit strategy. She's a former management consultant from Bain & Company, and most recently was the lead strategist for Wikimedia Foundation's grant making. Wikimedia is the nonprofit behind Wikipedia and supports grantees in over 80 countries. She now provides strategic consulting for organizations looking to bring focus, clarity, and equity to their next phase of work. Over to you, Sati.
Thank you so much, Zoya, and welcome everyone to part 2 of our call on participatory strategy. This is a follow-up, as Zoya said, to our first conversation, which was more of an introduction to the concept, as many people, both within the TAI network and beyond, were interested in the idea of participation within their processes, but when they were thinking about it being applied to their strategic processes, we're actually kind of struggling to envision what that might look like. And so as a part of this, the first part, as Zoya mentioned, was around, what is this concept? What do you need to consider before you might change your approach to strategy? And coming out of that, many of you asked, well, who does this? How do they do this? I have some questions around donor relations, change management, executive buy-in. So how are other people tackling these same questions? Most interestingly, though, one of the big assumptions was that participatory strategy could only be done with a geographic limit. So when we asked the question of, who do you think does participatory strategy? Most people said community-based funders, where there was a geographic scope, they could know everyone within that scope, and therefore it seemed more possible to have more people within their strategic process. And what we found is actually quite the opposite. It's really at scale when you're talking about organizations or community groups who are geographically distributed, who are trying to make an impact on an issue area that contextualized within other countries looks so vastly different. That's where more participation becomes critical, because a hierarchical or top-down approach to solving a global issue is just not going to work when that issue looks so different across, let's say, 100 or 200 companies. And so this is just a slice of the different organizations across sectors, across industries, and across focus areas who all take a more participatory approach to their strategic process. Today, we're going to focus on APC, CARE, and Prospera. And obviously, there's a lot of contextualized information within each of those examples. And so to help, you've received a set of case studies that outlines their organization, their governance structure, and the decision-making process for some key decisions within their most recent or upcoming strategy processes. So some of that information we're not going to cover today because it's quite dense, and you can find it out a bit later or maybe before if you've already done your homework. But we're going to focus on the information that is not easily found online. The values, the perspectives, the internal conversations that shaped and led to the examples that we're hearing about today. And so with that, I really want to start off with Anna from Prospera. I wanted to understand so much of the conversation that we have had are around, really starts off with this idea that if you're making decisions about people who don't look like you, who maybe are living more lived experiences around the issue you're trying to solve, then why aren't they ones leading the discussion? For me, that comes back to a conversation on equity. So I was wondering, what is your personal definition of equity that has shaped your work and how you think about strategy?
Oh, thanks, Sati. What a question! What a question to kick off the conversation with. Can I just start first by thanking Transparency and Accountability Initiative and thanking you personally for organizing this space and bringing us all together. It's a great question, actually. You know what equity is. And one thing I can definitely tell you is, as a feminist, as someone working for a political network of women's funds, equity and everything around dismantling existing power systems is one of the core values and core drivers. Equity to me, I guess, is about recognizing that there is different positions, there is different needs, there's also different desires, and taking those differences into account to ensure that all of us are able to fully access resources, rights, and opportunities. And beyond acknowledging diversity and existing inequalities, to me, equity is also about actively seeking to identify where power comes from, who holds it and why, whose voice we do not hear, and what we can do about redistributing power. As you said, I work for Prospera, which is a network of independent women's funds. It is a very diverse network, but it is also a very unequal network. And in line with current philanthropic trends, where most resources remain in the global north, especially when it comes to flexible core support, we also see how those trends affect the distribution of resources internally within the network and how they contribute to inequality. And I want to be clear that power inequalities do not stem only from access to resources, but also from geographic location, where funds are based, whether you're in Africa, whether you're in Asia, whether you're in Europe, fund scope of work, their leadership, their size, age of fund. So in a context like this, I guess actively practicing and promoting equity, it does require intentionality. It is not simply providing equal treatment to everyone. And that is why, as we gear up now for a participatory strategy framework process, we're working to set up mechanisms that will allow us to actively monitor participation and engagement, to pay attention who takes up how much space, what voices we do not hear, and take an active stance to allow for full and meaningful engagement of all. And in a global network like ours, that means looking at language justice, looking at time justice, where we need to look at timetables that accommodate us all from Fiji to Argentina, but also addressing colonial practices, racism, and many other issues that affect full participation. So just to sum it up, I think equity is not a simple act. It is a process. It is a process of active listening. It is a process of constantly correcting course. And I guess equity is not given. Equity is rather built. It's built together. It's built collectively. And I'll stop there.
I love all those things that you mentioned, Anna, because you're right. Like many times we think of and probably conflate equity with diversity and with inclusion, and that access is somehow sufficient for equity. And we know that's not to be true. Just because you invite someone to the table doesn't mean they actually have the power to share anything. Sarah, I'm interested in your thoughts on this question too, because obviously, as a different kind of international network, that, from historical roots also does have structural powers where there is this global north, global south perhaps divide, or it's in the room, I should say. And also as another membership-based network who had a participatory approach to strategy, I'm wondering, when you think about CARE's experience, when you determined who was going to participate, like how did you think about equity?
Yeah, I love Anna's point specifically about the kind of intentionality. And I think that's where the intentionality from the outset about where there are the power spaces within the organization and where there are power inequalities, right? So, and I think that intentionality of identifying those things from the outset, and then if the process is going to be, one that is designed around fostering greater equity in the organization, which I would say, I would find it hard to imagine a participatory process that didn't at least have some intentionality around that. Although actually that might be an interesting point to debate. But I think for any kind of organization that has some sort of kind of normative commitment to values and principles and justice in the world, which at least certainly CARE did, and many other kind of missional organizations do, identifying from the outset who within the organization and without of the organization, but I think starting at least from within, has the formal power, has the informal power, and where are their power imbalances that the process itself can help shift. And I think that who has to be a very intentional reflection point from the very outset, based on almost the design principles or the design parameters of the process. So if the process, so for CARE, the process was very intentionally related to a principle that the organization had already aligned around, which was rebalancing the kind of northern dominated flow of, expertise, resources, decisions, and formal power spaces. So in that recalibration process to foster greater equity, we wanted to build that intentionality into the process. And so that was one of the design principles that we got endorsement of from the very outset, so that then it could be a thread that went through every shape, the rest of how we shaped process, consultation, decision points, communication points, whose final review, whose, input, et cetera. Because otherwise you're kind of hearing from everyone, but you're not actually prioritizing perhaps that kind of intention of who you're most actively seeking out and listening to, and who's actually in a role of leading process, not just responding to or feeding back on something that others are designing. And so that kind of decision point at the outset of how the process is going to be designed, we call it design principles. Some people just call it, the kind of guiding parameters for the process or whatever. I think identifying there what equity, kind of what is it that you're aiming for? And then of course, there's just the broader understanding of other stakeholders and who needs to have a voice and who shouldn't. But I think that prioritizing about what's almost the critical one that you're going to pay most attention to and integrate and embed into every single part of the way the rest of the process is designed. And that in of itself is actually a really powerful shift that happens through the process in terms of empowering and kind of changing the way those flows of kind of the access and the resources and the who's making calls on things, who's shaping things, who has a seat at the table, then evolves.
Natalia, so my understanding is that I'd be interested to hear what your reflection on this who question is as well, given that APC goes through many different participatory processes, very much does a participatory approach to evaluation. We're all external partners, whether those are activists, informal groups, project partners, they're all giving that input and feedback into how the program or project actually went. And so I know that APC has a very expansive approach to participatory evaluation, but then within participatory strategy kind of brings it back into just who's in the network. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about why there's a distinction there in different parts of the program lifecycle about who participates.
Are you able to hear me all right? Okay, great. So thank you. I just wanted to thank on behalf of APC for giving us this platform to talk a little bit about how we go around our participatory processes. Given that we are a membership-based network, we have members across the globe, very diverse groups, individuals as well. So it's not just formal organizations, but also loose collectives that we work with. We work with a lot of individual activists. So in that sense, it's quite a broad range. And when we think about participation, I think the who and participation to what extent and in what processes, I think it all depends on the nature of what it is that you are working towards. And I think also keeping in mind that who will participate and to what extent very much depends on also the context of what is it that you're trying to do. I just wanted to highlight one thing here, that when we think about the who question, I think why it's also, I'm going to go back and look at why is it that we want to have a participatory approach. I think it's very important to answer that an organization, that what is the value that participation holds for the organization, because otherwise I think it just ends up being a performative act, and that's really not what you want it to be. I think like, for example, if I think about APC, and we know that the APC members, have very valuable lived experiences that are sort of nurtured by the local interventions that they have, and those are what feed into the different processes within APC, whether it's shaping our strategic outcomes or whether it is our evaluation processes. So I think that's really important in terms of determining who it will, who we engage and to what level, right? I think another thing to keep in mind is that, strategic processes, evaluation processes, these are not things that are very straightforward. These are often very intense, like time intensive, resource intensive, right? So we definitely keep that in mind, because we very heavily draw on these collaborative processes, but at the same time, we do realize that they take a lot for the participants as well. So I think when you recognize that, it's important to know that we don't want these processes to be extractive for the stakeholders that are involved. Just as an example, we have some of the members of APC, the formal members of APC, much more involved in our strategy processes, for example, as opposed to some of the partners that we work with on projects. And the reason is because, the members are very much a part of the formal network. They also, partake in resource sharing with us. So, we have a sub-granting program where a lot of our members also are able to receive those sub-grants. So I think, it's also about the stakes. With a lot of our partners, let's say, who are just involved much more on individual projects or initiatives, we cannot expect them to invest as heavily in these processes, and I think that would be very unfair. So I think keeping that in mind when we are thinking about, participatory processes is very important. So firstly, why? I think if you know, what the value of that participation holds to you, that's when you can identify the stakeholders. And I think the second thing is also to keep in mind that it is, these are resource intensive, time intensive processes. It takes APC almost 2 years of collaborative, meetings, whether that's async or in person, to actually even come up with the skeleton draft of our strategy. So I think it's important to be mindful of these things when we are thinking about participation.
Thank you for bringing up kind of this duality within participation, Natalia, that on one hand, many people, as they live their experiences, have ideas, have a better definition of the problem at hand, have many more ideas about what they might want to see as solutions. And yet, on the other hand, asking them to go through our processes and our steps, maybe sometimes more as a participant and not as a co-creator, can start to feel fairly transactional. Like, what did they get out of this process? Yes, ostensibly, we're all working towards the same goal, but also if you ask them to do a lot of unpaid work, especially in countries, let's say, where volunteering looks very different than some of our like Northern American expectations of what volunteering entails, it can start to feel much more like those power dynamics are putting people in a position where they have to do work for something that doesn't necessarily have reciprocity toward them. And so following up on that, Natalia, as we think about process, a process that to be successful, what would you say are for you 3 things that you think that any participatory process needs to have?
Sati, could you repeat the question? Sorry, my connection is not very good, so you're just cutting a little bit for me. Are you asking what are the prerequisites for a successful participatory process?
Yeah, exactly. What are 3 things that you think any participatory process needs to have to be successful?
Okay, so I think the 3 things I would say again, and going back to, I think, is the first one, and I think simply clear on why is it that you want to have a participatory process, whether it's a strategy making. You need to know why is it that this participation, right? So, and it's not about just going through the motions of the participatory process, but really we want to do this. I think that's, like, for starters, the most important thing. I think the second thing I would say is that you can process to really work. You need to have a system in place. There needs to be supporting infrastructure that allows for this kind of widespread consultation, right? To whatever extent or scale it is that you want to do it within your organization, you need to obviously figure that out, but you need to create the mechanisms for that to happen, right? So all stakeholders will play a role, whether that's activists, whether that's communities, whether it's, in our case, members, partners, board members, and I think that these kinds of process a lot about building consensus and landing this in a place where you all degree of acceptance, right? So it can only achieve when you have sort of very respectful spaces, continual iterative processes of sharing ideas, sharing alternative ideas, and kind of a very collective approach, but at the same time recognizing that everybody is coming from a different space, and I think it's creating that inclusive process where people feel free to express themselves. You create the structures for that to happen. So, just as an example, within APC, once we create our strategy, and the whole process of that is quite participatory. It involves a lot of different stakeholders. When it comes to the actual implementation, we decided that as organization, we needed to change the way that we were operating. So we changed the way we went about doing our staff meetings. We made sure that they were not as frequent, but they were a lot more in depth. We were involving a lot more members, even outside of the APC staff, to be able to contribute to those conversations, and looking at things beyond just our programming, wider issues within the organization. How do we strengthen ourselves as an institution? How do we think about what advocacy means for us, or communications means for us in the given context with the pandemic? So I think those kinds of things, thinking about the structures that allow for these conversations to happen, I think that's the second thing I would say is very important. And I think maybe again, the last thing I would say is to also be very mindful of the fact that when you are doing these sort of these sort of processes, it's important to keep in mind that it requires funding, it requires resources, it requires, whether that's staff time. You have to think about practically how do you make these processes as smooth as possible. So, keeping in mind that you need facilitators, you need documenters, these are the very practical aspects of these kinds of processes that allow for these discussions to happen and these spaces to be created. So keeping all of those aspects in mind, I think is very important.
Anna, as you create your current process, I'm sure a lot of these questions are top of mind for you. So I'm wondering, what your thoughts are on what Natalia just shared.
I think much of what Natalia was saying really resonates with me, and starting from the very basic question, like, why are you doing this? And I think I agree with everything in terms of, all of the resources, all the infrastructure that is needed to carry out processes like this. I guess I'd stress, and I apologize, maybe Natalia mentioned this, but just, she was breaking a little bit, so I didn't hear all of it. I think two things that are really essential for me is transparency. Like, that would be key for me for a participatory process. You need transparency, you need equal access to all of the information and accountability mechanisms. And I think that allows for, full participation, that allows for finding blind spots, that allows for so many things. So I guess what I'm struggling with, there is no one size fits all. Each participatory process will be different, and there will be adjustments that you will need to do that fit your organization, that fit what you want to do, your network. However, I think these are some basic ones that are absolutely essential for me, so that you can have a participatory process.
Sarah, I see you nodding, so go ahead.
I was going to say I can jump in. I fully resonate with all of that, and I was also reflecting on the addition of the transparency point. I think for me, if the two things that I would say are most critical, or from my experience have been most critical to kind of a successful process versus processes I've been involved in that I would say were less successful, were the intentionality of the design. And I think in that intentionality of the design, it's both those kind of what it is we want this process to achieve, who it is we want it to involve and why, right? And that's where those things about kind of equity considerations or formal and informal power spaces are so important. And the decision points, being really, really clear about those decision points and transparency about this is what the design of this process looks like. Here's, very simple, very simple kind of, there's this stage that is, reflection and listening. Then there is this stage that's themes and debates. And then there's this stage that is consolidating and deciding. And then, whatever it is. And here's who's involved and who's inputting. Here's who's deciding. Here's how it moves to the next stage. Here's who's inputting. Here's who's deciding. Here's how it moves to the next stage. And that can help guide the conversation, because people come in and out of things. And if they don't have a touch point to kind of know where they fit, who's deciding on what, I think that there's the pitfall of participatory strategies is going into it with this sense of like, all people on all things need to sit together and figure it all out. And I think that clarity around the transparency around where certain things have stage gates, have decision points, have, tensions that have to be resolved, need things that are debated is so fundamental. So I think that's the first critical thing. I think the second critical thing is strong facilitation. And I think that's what Anna and Natalia were referencing to also about that, just that strong kind of infrastructure, but that, somebody's got to be shepherding and convening and connecting the dots between these various kind of pieces of the process and who's inputting what and into what and how it's being brought together, taken to a decision, and then move to the next, stage or whatever. So I think that strong facilitation, including the kind of mechanisms to enable that, is really kind of what makes it run smoothly and work, and in a way that also can be a quicker pace than I think people often assume that participatory strategies take.
I love that you reframed from necessarily just like the process steps to the decision point, Sarah. I think that's such one of, I would say, the biggest reframes for me in terms of successful strategy. And I'm talking about, even if we take a step back, we're not even talking about participatory strategy per se. In all forms of strategy, to me, strategy is a process of making decisions, especially once you have all the ideas in the room, but now you have to converge on something. It is a series of trade-offs. It is a series of decisions. And so I think that's probably always the sticking point in any strategic process, but definitely in a participatory process when you've had this like swelling of ideas and perspectives, and now what do you do with all this information? One of my favorite quotes from Mickey Question is, the most important decision to make collaboratively is the decision about who makes decisions. And so it can be something that I would just flag this on top of everything that everyone else said, was that anchoring to decision points, having clarity around those roles and responsibilities and how you're going to get to those decisions and how those are going to lead and impact to decisions down the road, I think is probably one of the biggest stumbling blocks I have seen in any strategy process, but particularly in strategic processes that are more open, more collaborative, and more participatory. And so there tends to then be this natural question of blind spots. I love that many people have kind of hinted at this, of like things that I have learned after the fact. And so Anna, I'm wondering, what are some questions you're asking yourself?
It's a very difficult question. So Sati, we're working at Prospera, and we're making great effort to develop, to implement fully participatory, transparent strategic framing process that will be fully owned by the membership. However, any process has blind spots, or rather, probably a better term to use is biases or weaknesses. And I think it's much more productive to just acknowledge that and to actively seek to address it rather than just ignore it. And actually, now that you raise the question, when I think about these blind spots, I think it is a question that is very related to the first question you asked me about equity. So these biases, these weak spots, they are a result of the lack of equity and the persistent inequalities in terms of how power is distributed within the network. So working towards equity, I think it means constantly making effort to identify our own biases and to address them. So constantly asking ourselves questions, because I think the fact is we're all trained to not see, not hear some voices. Institutions have been designed to serve the needs of some. So it really is about unlearning how we know how to do things. On a Prospera level at the network, if we know there is inequalities, then what do we need to do to ensure that all voices are heard and that there is full engagement of all members? So I guess that goes to how do we promote transparency? How do we develop mechanisms? How we develop accountability mechanisms? I think all of these things, having all of these things in terms of infrastructure, it makes the work of identifying those biases easier. And I think one thing that is very important, and we've been learning this as we've been thinking about the strategic framing process, addressing this together as a community, where we listen to each other. I think it makes it easier to find those blind spots. It's ongoing work. It's not something that you can do only once. I think you really need to set up conditions for this so that it's ongoing. And I just want to refer to an example because it happens on so many different levels. Women's funds, they have amazing experience when it comes to participatory grant making processes, where it is communities themselves that decide where resources would go. However, still, what happens, what to do when a community does not see certain issues as relevant? Who is left behind? And this often happens within feminist movements for groups such as sex workers, trans persons, formerly incarcerated women, where the movement in many contexts not necessarily considers these relevant issues. So even on a level of women's funds, they're constantly asking themselves the question like, who are we not seeing? How can we ensure full representation and access to resources? And it's the same, you know, for us, when you put it on a network level, I think we're all the time, you know, just striving, what are the conditions that we need? What is the infrastructure that we need? And many of the things that Sarah was mentioning, so that, you know, we can catch these blind spots or biases, and we can do that deconstruction work.
Fantastic. I really love that you bring up this idea that even when your values aligned, even when you're been working with each other for a long time and there's a lot of trust, that there's still blind spots. This is still an iterative process. Sarah told me a very interesting story that I hope maybe she can elaborate on, about kind of these two different strategic processes that CARE went through, kind of the first attempt at a more participatory approach and what they learned from that, and then kind of how that informed, you know, the more success of the second. It seems like, Sarah, that there were blind spots that you ran into in the first iteration, and then obviously had to take the next step the next time to address that.
Yeah, and I think that's why I did kind of emphasize the decision points earlier as being a really key thing to be clear on from the outset, because what we at least found was there was kind of a really intentional effort and process to set up a kind of large participatory engagement for, I would say, the like input and the listening. But then it felt like it kind of stopped, and then it went to the powers that be for decision. And I think that's often the transition point that's the most challenging for participatory processes, right? Because somebody does need to make a decision, and there often are existing power spaces that one needs to attend to. Boards, for example, in my case, was working directly with our board. So we needed sign off, and we needed endorsement, we needed approval. And, you know, once it gets beyond this kind of very active and participatory listening, inputting, feeding in, what then happens for it to be actually consolidated, decided on, taken forward? And then does the shape of what you end up with, is it recognizable to all of those people who inputted in their ideas? And if you can't show that link, the kind of flow of input from this did inform this and in this way, or there were hard calls we had to make, there were decisions, there were trade-offs, and actually that piece didn't make it in, and here's why. So I think it's that transparency point and the kind of clarity around those decision points, so that it's not participatory until it's not, and then it just defaults back to power structures. And I think the kind of second iteration of our global strategic process, we were really, really thoughtful about how to set up those decision points at different stages throughout, and how the transparency of how things were being communicated out was recognizable kind of throughout, rather than like some end product that then gets rolled out and it's like, thanks for your input, 4 months ago, and nobody kind of knows what's happened since then. So I do think that kind of decision point is where it's hardest to be participatory, and so you have to be most kind of transparent and clear about perhaps what you're missing in those decision spaces, how you're trying to balance that, how you're trying to mitigate it, where the blind spots or the challenges actually are, and how, what that looks like in terms of the actual participatory commitments that you're making of the strategy.
Yes, that's such a big challenge, and I'm really glad you named it, that like a participatory process could be participatory only in one section of the process. And then it leads to misexpectations around, well, I was so engaged now, and now I'm just going to be informed after the fact, 6 months later, like what happened? It starts to kind of degrade maybe some of the trust and commitment and the time that people felt like they committed to your process based on a promise that seemed to have been made. Natalia, APC has a really interesting story around an outcome, a strategic outcome or strategic goal that wound up in the 2023 strategic plan that was really from a groundswelling from the membership. I was wondering if you could talk about that, to give us an example of how there was, in a sense, a blind spot or a missing piece that the membership really wanted to see in the end product.
Sure. The outcome area that Sati is referring to is it's a new area of work that APC has added to our strategy. It's basically around environmental sustainability, specifically in the context of digital spaces. Keeping in mind, APC is it's a network which has been there since the past 30 years. And if you go to the history of the network, we are very strongly rooted in the green movement. So it's not like it was something new. It was definitely a priority as we started out, but as the organization evolved, it just, I suppose, in some sense took a backseat. And it was actually really interesting because this was one particular area that was very much member-led. It was not something that we as APC, as in, within the staff, had particular expertise around. So it was the members who really prioritized this, who really wanted this to be something that we work collectively towards, and so had a very active role in terms of also framing this outcome. What is it that we're going to do? What are going to be the objectives? Who are the stakeholders? And even in the work that we do now, as we are implementing this 4-year strategy, this is one part of APC's strategy where, we are very, we count very heavily on the members in terms of the substantive input as well, and in the work, and it's really been in that sense bottom up, I suppose, and a process that has been led by the members. And even now, as we implement this particular piece of the strategy, the members really do the kind of they're at the front of this, and we are learning as APC staff so much from the membership. So it was a very interesting example of really how through this sort of very collaborative participatory process that APC has, where there is so much back and forth, that we were able to see that, okay, this seems to be really something that is important to the communities that we work with. This is really what they want. And, obviously we do consider the practical elements of whether it is in fact something, because there is the wish list is, it's a huge wish list, and there's so much more that we can do, but we also have to then consider, practically speaking, in terms of our capacities, it's something that we can actually take on. So there's definitely that aspect. So it's not like we'll do everything and anything under the sun, but we definitely let the network really kind of take decisions, even when it comes to deciding really at the strategic level, what is it that we want to work towards.
That's such a fantastic story. I actually didn't know that APC had a lot of roots in the green movement. And so I didn't know that back connection, but it's fascinating to hear that it was, as the membership evolved, as the network evolved, a piece that maybe had felt like it'd been left behind. The membership felt like it was so important to bring it back forward, definitely at a time where climate change is so prevalent and affecting so many different parts of the world. And APC as a network that spans almost the entire world, makes sense that this climate aspect needed to be addressed. I know we've talked a lot about process, but I kind of want to shift the question to governance a bit, because a lot of our participants from last time were, for the most part, from a positionality of power, right? They weren't CEOs, they weren't the major donors, they weren't board members, they were staff, program officers, maybe directors of their own organizations, and trying to figure out, even if I'm bought in, I don't know how to create buy-in of my leadership. And one of the big questions actually that came up was around donors, especially for foundations who work with living donors. And those donors have expectations around how their funds will be distributed, how their engagement, and how some of the decision-making power lies with them because it's their money. So Sarah, given kind of the huge different parts of your experiences, I'm wondering, how would you approach a living donor to gain their buy-in around shifting to a more participatory approach to strategy?
So I think, just like with any other vested power is very hard to change overnight. And I think we all, anyone in the business of kind of social change or whatever, we're very aware of that. And I think having a really thoughtful strategy for how anybody with kind of that type of power and authority and resources is engaged and is brought along is a critical part of the design process. So what does it look like? And I think part of it is also kind of understanding where that person or that group's mindset currently is. So I have actually, I currently work with a lot of private sector organizations, and I found that there are some spaces where terms like participatory strategy just don't make sense to use. And that's okay. You know your audience, right? You don't need to call it something for it to be something. So for me, kind of understanding what is the kind of most critical shifts that we want to see, that kind of what's the aim, right? What's the kind of, end goal? How can we build that into kind of the design of a strategy process? What's the best way to bring that person along? So for me, two things have worked well. One is that aligning and getting the person's kind of steer on the principles. So what it is we actually want to achieve, because then you can kind of monitor or justify or communicate anything that follows in light of that, right? And that was kind of agreed on and set by somebody who does have an important say in the process. So that kind of alignment on that from the outset, so that anything else that follows you can kind of refer back to. I think that's really important. I think the second thing is a recognition that it may not be the 100% that you want, but 10% might be good enough for right now. So I think that journey, that kind of patience in the journey has been a really kind of, I think, lesson that I've had to learn, where I feel like, wait, what I actually want out of this, and the kind of, fully, what I would say is fully participatory, fully equitable, fully, process, it may not be actually where we're at this point. So what's the right first step? And then maybe the next iteration, the next time around, it's the next kind of 20% of that. And that in that journey itself, the changes will happen. So I think for me, I've found that the process of participatory strategy and kind of just participatory processes in general can change and reshape an organization because of what you're socializing, the ownership that you're building, the buy-in that you're building, the kind of different mechanisms for different voices to come to the fore. And so I think if that is happening, a living donor has to be part of that. What's that person's role throughout? And I think that can be, I think that intentionality around the kind of political engagement. One of the learnings that we had at CARE after the first round of strategy, we set up a reflective kind of outsider perspective, reflecting along with us as we went through the process of both setting the strategy and then going through this kind of transformational change piece we went through. And it was an academic researcher who was basically partnered with us to kind of track and reflect back and challenge us on kind of what she was observing. And her biggest observation, biggest learning out of that first stage was our under-attention to politics. Do not under-attend to politics. You can design the best thing in the world, but if you're not really thoughtful about that kind of lens of the political and the power, and what you're going to be doing to actually influence and shape and kind of bring that along, then it's not really going to achieve the change that you want. And so we built that in very intentionally to the next stage of our process. I almost feel like I went in looking more at that than at anything else. And I think at least where we were at as an organization, given the numbers of kind of very, board members, donors, et cetera, who did have a lot of power and did have a lot of say about whether things were going to move or not, or be resourced or not at the end of the day, I think set us up for a lot more successful process the second time around.
Fantastic. I'm so glad that you brought up that you can actually, it's not so much one person, it's actually many different seats of power who you're kind of all attending to and shepherding really at once. And that that can be overwhelming. Having definitely gone through that, it feels like there are sometimes two parallel processes of participation that are going on. One is kind of the thing that we've been talking about, and participants perhaps outside of your organization, outside of your network. There's kind of all of that infrastructure and orchestration. And then there's the internal part. There's this whole other vein of change management, buy-in, conversations happening internally to create, plant seeds, water the seeds, germinate the seeds, that kind of inside work that, some people feel like there is a what comes first question. Like, do I do that work and then prove it? Do I do the outside work, prove it works, and then that's my case point for inside? I really want to come back to this question of like what comes first, but Anna, Prospero does so much work to influence funding flows. I mean, as a secretariat yourself, you're not giving out, funds. It's really you are influencing funding flows for your funds to be more effective and to have more resources to do their work. So kind of what are your conversations with donors or people who hold money look like?
Right. So, thank you, Sati, for giving me the opportunity, because I wanted to jump in based on what Sarah was commenting as well. I think it goes down to the question, who are you accountable to? And I think there will be different answers for many of us here in the room having these conversations. I think you're right. I think when we're thinking about this and the role of donors and everything, I think it's looking at the institutional design, the governance structure, revising your organizational culture, all the way to the actual process of designing and implementing the strategic process. So I want to go through a little bit, how are we organized in Prospera? How is the structure? Who are we accountable to? And why we think we have the conditions to kick off a process like the one we're planning. So we have a secretariat, which sort of shepherds the process, a secretariat which is accountable to the board, and then we have a board which actually comes from the membership, and a board that is accountable to the membership, and then members who are all accountable to each other. So I think that's an interesting governance and decision-making setup, which I think allows for a process like this to be carried out. Of course, we also receive money from donors, but I think it's slightly different, the correlation and who we're accountable to. We work to influence funding flows, where we take all of the knowledge that comes from what it means to have participatory grant-making mechanisms that comes from the women's funds that are part of our network, and we feed that knowledge into how we influence funding flows, where money goes. But I think we have internally a governance structure that allows for no interference from other interests, from donors' agendas, for us to have this strategic planning process. And I think it's also about just being open, going to your funders and just saying like, and that is what we're actually doing. This year, we're going to focus on this process. This is something that is very important to the network at this particular moment. All of our effort, all of our resources, all of our energy is going to go down to this process. This is how we're thinking about it. This is, all of the, how we're revising the processes, how it's going to happen. And we're going to hold it amongst ourselves, and we're going to be accountable to each other. And, we sort of limit it.
Natalia, I see you saying in the chat, it's very similar to APC.
Yes, and I'd love to hear from her, how it looks like for them.
Yeah, I'm just gonna jump in again because it's very interesting, Anna, what you said, and I think responding to your question in terms of how we look at donor relations, I wanted to you have transactional relationships, and then you have transformative relationships. with funders. And I really think for APC, it's the latter. And we really, I think it's not like it happens overnight. I think that, this has been years and years of relationship building, which has led us now to this point where our relationship with a lot of our funders is not just about the money that they give us. I think it is a lot that they are also able to get from the network. So as an example, as COVID hit, APC being a virtual organization had a lot of experience, expertise, resources of how to exist and thrive in an online space, right? And a lot of funders were actually reaching out to us to get some sort of support in how they could hold online convenings in a better way, how they could, also to get insights and inputs on how is it that the pandemic is affecting the lives of a lot of the smaller organizations or individuals that are a part of the network that they are not necessarily directly in contact with, right? So I think in that sense, we play a very, donor advocacy is very central to the APC strategy. It is integral to what we do. And I think it's very important for us that we keep having these conversations. So the last 2 years, so much of our advocacy has been centered around how the pandemic is affecting the lives of individuals and organizations and how it has affected the pace at which they can work. What are the additional resources that they need? And we've actually, as a very interesting example with some of our funders who, we've managed to convince that when you are budgeting for online events, we need to create more space, for people to be able to, you need to give people resources for connectivity, because not everybody is coming from the same, space. Not everybody will have the same, access. So we make sure there's a stipend for that. We keep in mind that if somebody is connecting for a 5-hour meeting from their home, they probably have to take care of meals, or they need childcare, and we need to provide for that to happen. There is an assumption that if people are just kind of working, from home, or they are, they're just working from in the virtual space, that, all of these things magically take care of themselves. But, we've had those conversations with funders, and to be honest, I think funders have really also come to us. It has also been initiated from their side to try to understand these dynamics and what is it that is needed. So I think that's how I would say that it's been. And again, going back to Anna's point, yes, it is a very important question. We are accountable to our funders for sure, but really, everything that APC does is grounded in our strategy, which has been defined and led by the network. And that is the work that we do. We do not let those priorities be defined by external actors. This is the kind of framework within which we operate.
I love hearing those different examples around the role that funders play, how much weight they have within the process. Talking about childcare, my partner is taking care of my small baby so that I can be here, right? Like there's just so many behind the scene things, negotiations and conversations to make. And so I kind of hear, different perspectives coming out from Sarah's perspective of a donor who's like, yeah, I will either fund this or not fund this if I don't see something in the strategy, to all the way to other examples of people saying, this is our strategy, either fund it or don't. I'm going to go find somebody who's going to work with us. And so just two vastly different examples. But one of the threads that I can see is this idea between governance, how people are with power are involved or sharing power, what accountability looks like. And so there becomes this question naturally, like, what comes first, right? Do I need to kind of do the internal work to change my politics, or to address politics, to change my governance structure, et cetera, et cetera? Or do I do the participatory part first? And then that's my proof point. So I wonder, Sarah, maybe you can speak a bit to that around like this kind of chicken or the egg question.
I mean, I don't think there's a right answer in that it could either be the chicken or the egg, because I think it's kind of just starting from where you're at, right? So I think my experience in a very, I would say, kind of complex confederated structures, CARE and several others that I've been part of and helped advise or guide strategy processes. The governance arrangements in those types of organizations are really complex. And I think that, and it's just, you just have a lot of stakeholders with a lot of power and a lot of perspective and a lot of independent, kind of their own independent kind of reporting and regulatory and governance kind of jurisdictions that all come to bear. And so yes. And so I think for me, while I think it would be easier and ideal to set up the ideal kind of governance model first, I don't think that's usually the pragmatic approach to take, because I think those sorts of changes just are hard. They take time, and waiting around till that gets sorted is something that just feels just not like a practical, like, let's just move and get this done. And I think also being really thoughtful about how the process itself can reveal certain deficiencies in the system, can reveal the blind spots, right? It can reveal the entrenched power dynamics. It can reveal the fact that everybody wanted this thing out of the strategy except for that one voice. And guess what? We had to include it that time around. And what does that say about who actually has a say and how equitable or not we are? And that, I think that can be often the most telling. The best use of the process is to reveal some of your own institutional issues that can then be course corrected and kind of, within an organization I worked with, which I won't name, kind of this was really complicated conversation, and actually through the process itself identified kind of significant blockers who had significant power, that actually there was then an intentional process to remove them, because I think they were kind of really holding back the rest of the organization and what that looks like. So removing them from the board. And the board took action to do that. And I think it was only through the process that was really revealed, like how entrenched that was really revealed.
Natalia, sorry, my Simon baby wants to be a part of this too. But I love this idea that the process in and of itself is revealing. I think there's a particular strategic approach of saying, let's try this, because it is in some ways a reflective practice in doing something different. We realize kind of what we really wanted out of the old process, and actually what was just like, oh, I didn't really care. That was just how we had done things forever. And so, thinking about those, it's almost like a pilot. Thinking about those first examples, those first things you try. There's a kind of interesting question of, especially given your positionality, let's say you're a program officer or head of a program, right? Like, do you start off with a programmatic strategy? Because that's in your wheelhouse. That's in your scope of control. And then say, hey, this works. Maybe we should try it on a larger scale. Or do you start with almost the strategic lens, because that is going to influence so many different programs and processes and things like that. And so, Natalia, I'm kind of wondering, given that APC does strategy obviously at a network level and an organization level, but also at a programmatic level, and that programmatic level involves so many other partners, I'm wondering for you, how do you think about this interplay between the programmatic strategy processes and the organizational strategy processes, and how they're participatory in different ways?
Sure. So I think this is a really interesting question for APC, because of the fact that, the way that we are, so if you look at our strategy, we actually have outcome areas which are sort of thematically defined. And then if you look at our different programs, we have thematically designed programs, but within that, we also have sort of regional sub programs, you can say, no? So it seems a little complicated in terms of what comes first. Like, I would say it would very much depend, but I think a lot of these processes also kind of go on simultaneously or parallel to each other. And I'll give an example of that. I think that for some things, we actually started something at a very program level. And I'll give an example of that. So APC has a women's rights program, and we started with we call it like a shared leadership model. So essentially we have no one particular manager for that program. There are 3 co-managers who are kind of, have a completely shared managerial responsibility for that program. And it was around 2 or 3 years back, I believe, that we implemented this shared leadership model. And we started with just the women's rights program. It was not something that we were doing organization-wide. And really the idea was that we felt that WRP was at that kind of place in terms of their history and in terms of their field, where they were placed. It seemed like it was an option that we could pilot this particular model with that program. And there were a lot of learnings, a lot of things, experiences of the WRP program, which then fed into shared leadership, which we expanded more organization-wide. So there were other programs now that are implementing a similar model, because we have learned a lot from the experiences of WRP in terms of what works, in terms of what doesn't work, what are the challenges, what is it that we need to do differently. And I think we took that, and now we are implementing shared leadership models across some of the other different programs of APC, and also more organization-wide. So we have a much broader senior management committee, which is looking at more organization-wide issues, cross-thematic issues, things like strengthening the organization, looking at the role of our communications technology department, looking at the role that advocacy plays for all the different programmatic work that APC does. So I think that that's been a very interesting way, where we started at the program level and then we took it more organization wide. But in some cases it has started, like, just in terms of how APC is structured, very much it has always, for us, it's the participatory process. It's just very much a part of just how we are structured as a membership based network. So it's very much a part of our formal governance structure. So I think it's a little bit of both.
I love that you gave those both examples and really emphasized how it's not one or the other. And I really think that's such a critical message, that a lot of times in shifting any kind of processes or any kind of change, it starts to feel like a binary. It's either what I've done before or it's something new. But really, I think it's always about the third way. It's about saying, what is this journey that I'm on to go from where I am today to where I want to be? I understand it's a spectrum of change. I understand I have to bring a lot of people along with me. And sometimes at different points in time, I'm going to use different tactics. I really think that's one of the core messages, that this is not a monolithic approach. This is not a recipe that someone just takes and they follow the steps and then they get the right outcome. It's not an equation. I do think that what's interesting in the different examples that everyone shared is that they were kind of different. There was a foundation on which people were operating, and that was the first, touch point of change. So whether, for APC and for Prospera, the governance was intentionally created to have these kind of interdependent forms of accountability, versus for some of the NGOs that we know of, right? Like, it is much more hierarchical, pulling from other kind of archetypes. And so we have this question from Laura around, what type of preparation is there needed, and that how does that preparation actually affect the quality or the success of participation, given the preparation. So as an example, I used to work for the nonprofit behind Wikipedia, right? Wikipedia is an online encyclopedia where anyone can edit. And what that meant was that before we even did a movement strategy, 15 years in or 10 years in, it meant that civil discourse was already such a strong part of the culture, that you could disagree with somebody and say, at the end of the day, there has to be a decision made. And even if I didn't like it, I'm still going to move forward. I'm still going to be a part of this movement. It doesn't become, I don't like this, therefore I leave. And so that civil discourse was such a critical enabler from the cultural perspective for being able to do a movement-wide global process. And so, yeah, I guess that's my question to any of our panelists here. Like, have you found that the quality of participation increases with some kind of preparation, and what that preparation or what that foundation was? And I see you're already unmuted, so, or Sarah, either one.
I can just very quickly answer. So absolutely, Laura, I think it's a kind of spot on point. And I think the challenge when you're looking at these kind of organization-wide, kind of global scale, so many stakeholders types of processes, it's how do you kind of prepare and equip, particularly those who have had less access to power, who have had less kind of exposure even to the types of discourse or the language or the strategies or whatever that others are kind of well versed in. And so I think, and that can actually be a really disempowering experience, which of course you wouldn't want to set up. One thing that, so I think your example is a really good one. One thing that I've done with an organization recently is actually create spaces, debate spaces. So there are a couple of themes in their current strategy that are, or I would say conflicting almost. It's like, one of them, just as an example, is actually about, are we kind of devolving our funds and our resources to local actors? But then the fundraising team came with a goal of, no, we're going to be a $1 billion organization by, X year. Now, those two strategic priorities are in tension, right? It's kind of our own financial growth versus kind of devolving power and decision making. That those are competing priorities, and those emerged from the participatory process. So what we actually did was structure debate spaces. And what it did is it required less kind of preparation of like individual by individual by individual, but it almost gave a model or a template or a format for how to engage. So very kind of guided almost, when you raise a point, it's in this way. When you disagree, do it this way. So it's almost like a structured, we draw on kind of philosophical like debate, deliberation spaces, that there's a structured form, and that almost sets the level playing field for how the participants are all coming into that space with almost the kind of same participation about, what that preparation looks like, what that space can look like. So that was one tactic we used in a way that felt, I guess, more manageable than like preparing everybody on the back end. I think those embedded things in the organization, like having civil discourse already or having co-creation kind of internally already before engaging in the organization, are critical enablers. But I think in the meantime, there's ways to kind of mitigate that by how spaces are structured and set up.
So in terms of the preparation, I'll just jump in. It hasn't been easy. Especially during the pandemic, we haven't been able, as a network, we haven't been able to physically come together and meet each other for the last 2 years. So it has taken a while, and we spent at Prospera most of last year really thinking about, how to set the ground to embark on a strategic framing process next year. So we've really invested in doing these town hall meetings, how we call them, which bring together all of the membership. Where we work together from, why do we need a strategic framing process? And I think it goes, it's slightly related to the previous question. And one thing that is important for us is also coherence. How do we model the change that we want to see? If we advocate actively to funders about, where resources should go, how should that be done? How can we also model internally within the network that change? So, why do we exist? Who do we serve? How can we be more intentional about the change that we want to see? I think much of it comes from that idea. And then through these town hall meetings, we really have been working together to co-create, think together, what are the thematic issues that we want to address as part of the strategic framing process, where we identified 4 different issues. One, thinking together about the context, where are we seated, what is the context in which we operate as a network, then what are the values that hold us together, what is the governance structure that we need, internally in the network to set us up for success, and the vision, where do we want to go? And it's going to be a long process. It's going to be, I don't know, at least a year-long process. And that's why we want to, use it to think long-term, to think for the next 10 years, where does the network want to go? And then, once we've had these 4 thematic lines around which we wanted to have conversations, then we started thinking, like, how do we ensure, given all of the inequalities that we have, that we do incorporate all of the voices in all of this? So there is, an opportunity to just choose what thematic group you're going to work on. But then, we're also doing conversations and engaging membership through the different regions. So each region will have to, think a little bit about these questions, and then the different types of funds. So there is national funds, there is multi-regional funds, there's regional funds. So how do we, incorporate all of these different perspectives into the design of the process? And at the same time, how do we think about the language justice? How do we think about participation? So we've thought about, having somebody who's just going to pay attention to, who is talking, how much, whose voice do we not hear? So then there is the steering committee as well. The other issue that we faced was, how do we make sure that, it does not stay all of it in silos, but it's all connected. And there is that overall monitoring and observation. So we've also thought of having a steering committee, which is basically comprised of the board, the secretariat staff, but also members from the membership that, will supervise and touch base and see that it all fits to each other, and it adds value. So I think it's really complex. I still don't know. I mean, we're still creating it. We're going to kick it off next January. So, I'm afraid I cannot offer any specific lessons. I can offer lessons in terms of, the planning and how we've moved. And this is as far as we've come together. It is complex, but I guess, going back to a point that Sarah was making, we're open to change. I think change is inevitable. And probably if you don't change anything throughout the course of the participatory process, you haven't been listening. So I think we're keeping an open mind and just active listening, and we'll see where we get.
One of the things that we had a quick question here on how long did processes take, and is it possible to do strategic, open or participatory processes on a strategy refresh, which is like the 3 to 5 year typical time scale? And I will say that pretty much yes. I think APC does their strategic processes every 4 years. CARE was obviously doing something a little bit larger than a strategy per se. They were doing more of a vision and then a framework. And so they were on a 10-year scale, but their strategic process, right, only took maybe like 18 months. I know Prospera, you're thinking about, given you're kind of doing more than just the strategy itself, you're doing your governance, you're doing, your values, you're looking at the external context and all those things. I think you're thinking about that like 18 to 2 year kind of time frame too. I will say from Wikimedia that we did spend 3 years, but again, we were doing a 10-year strategic direction. And so what we were also doing was completely restructuring the movement. So new organizations were coming out, money was being moved from one place to another. The way that people were actually, like the way our chapters look, the way our different organized versus unorganized groups look, how actually this thing was going to be implemented. So I think it's really important to say that the length of time depends on how big your scope is. Are you, and I don't know who exactly asked this question, but a lot of times I would say in the best processes, especially when these open processes, it's not just around aligning on goals. It's about working in that transition space from strategy to implementation, to not just saying, here's the thing, go off and run with it, and people go do what you need to do. It's really about co-creating that transition space on what does this look like practically? How am I supposed to change? How am I accountable to really the things we said we were going to do? And what does that impact on, how my organization looks, how we operate, who we work with, and all those kinds of things. So I think the interesting part around participatory processes is, yes, they take more time. Yes, they are more resource intensive, but they're also, I think, because they're so intentional around all parts that strategy actually touches and impacts, it starts to be more than just the strategic process as a finite element, and more around how are we actually working together towards these goals, whether that's at a program, project, or department or organization level. And I know I wasn't supposed to answer this question, but I just think that I knew across the board some of these answers. So I think the last question, and maybe that will close with, I actually want us to say, does anyone of our participants have a specific question they want to ask? Otherwise, we'll close with just, what's your advice to people who are trying to do this? So yeah, I would invite any of our participants, if you have a question, just unmute, and we'll see. Yeah, go for it. And if not, then we will, there is a question, obviously, that everyone has, which is, what's your advice to me? If I'm going to try, if I want to attempt this, if I was just in coffee with you and I was just kind of saying, like, I'm a little overwhelmed by the prospect of this change. I don't know what to do first. It's kind of all forms this question takes, but maybe Natalia, what would be your advice to somebody who was going to attempt this change in their strategic process?
Advice, I don't know if it's advice per se. I think it's very difficult to be sort of prescriptive when it comes to something like this, these processes. But I think, like, if I think about it, like even from an APC perspective, but even otherwise, right? When we think about a participatory approach, whether that's strategy making, whether that's evaluation processes, or any other organization-wide processes, like I would be like, okay, here are some of the things that you really need to prioritize or pay attention to, right? So one thing that I think is key is thinking about who is it that we are including, right? So wherever, no matter what your stakeholders are, what groups they are, there are always going to be those more visible and those less visible voices. And I think it is our job to make sure that when we do design these processes, we have to go beyond the kind of usual suspects. It has to be about, like if I speak about it in the context of APC, we want to go beyond just activists who are part of formal structures. We want to open the spaces of participation to, informal collectives, to individuals, to connectors who are working outside of these formal spaces, right? And really thinking about how can we ensure that these groups, these individuals also have access to resources and opportunities. I think that's one definite thing to, I think, really have at the back of your mind when we are thinking about creating these spaces. I think the second thing would be going back to what Anna said right at the beginning. I think it really struck a chord with me. It's really about contributing to shifting power structures. These processes should not just be for the theatrics or the performative element. They cannot be extractive and just shift more responsibilities on people who already are overburdened. It has to be about giving people real decision-making power. So, it has to, that's really, really key. And I think the third thing that I want to talk about, and I think it's so important to mention that here, is because I feel like over the last 2 years, we've really seen that, just everything has changed, right? The contextual realities of the pandemic, we are still very much, I was in a panel, it was a very Eurocentric panel a couple of months ago, and someone said, post-pandemic, in this post-pandemic era, and here I am sitting in Pakistan where, like, there's a freaking lockdown, and, my child's school is closed, and there are so many people who are still dying, and, vaccination rates are not the same. There's so much politics to even the vaccine. I have the Chinese vaccine. I can't travel to Europe. Nobody, it's complicated. It's complex, and it has real practical impacts on people's physical health, emotional health, mental health. It has an impact in terms of the pace at which, organizations and individuals can operate. I think funders really need to think about contractual agreements, building in flexibility and care I think care is a very important thing that we miss out on. I think it's about, really keeping in mind that there are consequences to this, and it has affected people in a very real way. And funders also need to respond to these changing realities. And I think that's really, really key. I think I would like to end on that note.
Perfect. And I know we're a bit over time here, but I do just want to give Sarah or Anna just a quick minute to see if there would be anything you might add to the really strong points that Natalia mentioned.
I can just really quickly, I mean, I agree with everything Natalia said, so I won't repeat, I'll build. I think the two additional reflections I have are, I think I've kind of emphasized this, but like, don't underestimate kind of paying attention to power in politics and the formal spaces that are there, because that will make or break. It'll undermine a process, and then that damages actually those who've participated. So I think being really pragmatic about that, balancing kind of what the ideal shape is, and then also the reality, and just taking the steps where you can. And then two super practical tips. I think frameworks are your friend. So I feel like any good participatory process has great frameworks to guide that are being tested, iterated, whatever. It helps people understand the direction, the kind of frame that they're contributing into, and it helps structure participation. And I think structured participation is really valuable. And the second thing is that pilots are your friend. I think starting with a pilot is actually my personal learning is that has been my most useful tool for then bringing about the longer term, bigger changes, is just by starting with a simple pilot, because it's really hard for anybody to say no to a pilot. So the pilot with the intentionality about the learning questions, the participatory nature of it, and then how that can have ripple effects, I think can be really powerful.
Right, I'll just do a brief recap of, where my ideas are and what I'm taking from the conversation so far. I guess to everyone who's thinking about this, just the first and most important question would be, why do you want to do a participatory strategy process? What does it mean for your institution or for your network? Who are you accountable to, and who needs to own the process? It is very complex work. It is resource intensive, as my colleagues were sharing, and there is no one formula to doing it. It means listening to the constituents you're accountable to. It means adjusting. It means correcting. It means being intentional. And it also requires you revise every aspect of your work. It requires you to look at your institutional design, your governance structure, your decision-making processes, as Sarah was saying, looking at the organizational culture, all the way to the actual process of designing and implementing the strategic planning process. So do we have the infrastructure for a process like that? And if not, can we design it? And I guess the other point that I'm going away with, do it not only because everyone is talking about participatory strategy processes right now, do it because you believe in it, and because it's really the only possible way to lead to meaningful change, where communities themselves design, own, and lead their way to the change they want to see. And I just want to finally thank Sati for bringing us together. I learned a lot from both Sarah and Natalia. Also, Sati, from the conversations, the preparation conversations I had with you. You helped me see many of these blind spots. And I really look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you as we enter the strategic framing process next year. I think it will be of great support, just keeping open communication with all of you.
Thank you all. I'll hand it back to Zoya, but this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm glad we had just enough time to cover all the different topics we wanted to. And to all of our listeners out there, I hope you walk away with much more understanding of what it takes, what it means, and what it implies to think about a change in your strategy process. And so I'll hand it back over to you, Zoya.
Thank you, Sati, and thank you everyone for the discussion. Special thanks to Sarah and Natalia for sharing your insights with us, and to Sati for facilitating such a discussion. We will package the call summary, case write-ups, and the recording for those who couldn't join today. And of course, all the participants will be receiving the same package. And this will be a living resource on this topic together with the call one content. And we invite your ideas on what will be useful beyond this. We will send a brief survey to the participants to collect these ideas, and hopefully this will be an encouragement for some more exciting calls and products. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you all. So great to see you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
We did it, Zoya. Wait, is the recording ending? Please end the recording.